In this lecture, we'll be putting our knowledge of bones and weight painting to the test by rigging a basic leg. Okay, so I'm in the basic startup file. I'll hide the camera and light so they don't get in the way and distract us. And I'll use the default cube for the thigh. So I'll scale that, but press Shift Z so it doesn't scale in the Z. And we can have a thigh like this. I'll go to side view with 3 on my numpad and move that above this sort of imaginary floor, the y-axis here, to somewhere around here. I'll rotate it very slightly. That helps us to kind of visualize the leg. I'll press Shift D to duplicate that and rotate it the other way. So we've got the shin bone there. And I'll scale this down a tiny bit to something like this. And then we want a foot. So I'll press Shift D to duplicate one of these. And I'll press Alt S to remove any scaling and Alt R to remove any rotation. And then I'll start modeling the foot. So I'll place it on our imaginary floor, move in a bit, Alt Z to go to X-ray mode, Tab to go into edit mode, and box select the 4 vertices at the end here. I'll just show you that I've got those selected as well because I selected in X-ray mode. Back to side view, E to extrude, out to about here, select these two, the one in front and the one behind, G to grab in the Z axis, and then these 4, E to extrude, and pull it out like this. So this is slightly different to the legs because we'll have 2 bones for the foot, the main foot and the toes. So we'll be able to talk a little bit more about the differences in weight painting. Okay, I'll adapt the shape very slightly. So back into object mode, I'll move this down, make the thigh a little bit bigger. I'll select these at the end, scale them down and move them down as well. And then for the calf, I'll do the same, scale these down and move those down so they're near the foot. Mine aren't overlapping, but it doesn't matter if they are, it's not important. Okay, so I'll go back into object mode and press Alt Z so we're out of wireframe mode and we've got our lovely looking leg there. So pause the video here and catch up with me making a simple leg. Okay, so let's add our bones. I'll press Shift A to add, armature, and again you'll see a single bone appear. I'm selecting mine. I'll come to the Object Data Properties, Viewport Display, and tick in front. I'll go to side view and into edit mode. I'll select the whole bone, G to grab and move that to the top here. Select the very top of the bone, G to grab, move that down to the knee, E to extrude out, down to the ankle, E to extrude out, down to the toes, and E to extrude out once again for the toes. Now it's a good idea to label these, so I'll select the first bone. F2 is the quick way to go to the bone names, or you can go to the bone options here and choose the bone there, or you can actually go all the way up to the armature up here and go into the armature and into the bone there as well. But F2 is the quick way, and I'll call this upper leg. Select the next one, call this lower leg. There's lots of naming conventions for bones, but they're not important for the moment. Next one, F2, foot, and next one, F2, toes. I'll also go into object mode and select our cubes and rename those. So this is upper leg, F2 and lower leg, and we'll select the foot, F2, and call it foot. Okay, so catch up with me and put in your armature and rename your objects. So we are ready to attach our objects to the bones. Now, of course, these are separate objects. I could join them together and attach them to the bones. That would work as well. But I'll leave them like this to show you that you can have separate objects to one armature. That's important for things like clothing, backpacks, weapons, and so forth. They can be separate objects from your main character, but still be attached to the character's armature. But a lot of the time you'll start off with one single object and you'll attach that to the bones. We'll do that later on. Now before you parent, it's always a good idea to save your work at this point. It's not very often, but occasionally this will go a bit glitchy and you'll need to come back to this point, and it's not always as easy as it seems. So I'll quickly save my work. And now's a good time to catch up with me, building your armature and renaming your objects, and of course saving your work. Now one thing I did forget to mention, and it's always good practice, try and have a think what that is. So that's selecting our objects and making sure that they don't have non-uniform scales. If I press N and go up to item, we can see that the active object here, it does have uniform scale, but it's not a scale of 1. So we need to apply the scale. So Control A and apply the scale. Okay, now I can shift select the armature, press Control P and choose with automatic weights. Now it's time to test. So I can press Control Tab and go straight to pose mode and maybe wiggle the toes. That looks fairly good, but you can see the back of the heel moving slightly there as well. Let's try the foot. You can see a bit of the lower leg moving with that, and the lower leg, that's working well. So it's worth noting, as I pointed out, the lower leg is not influencing the upper leg, and that's most likely the proximity of this lower leg. If I press Alt-R, there was a nice big gap between there, so Blender kind of knew that this bone was this object. Whereas these two objects were a bit closer, and if I select the foot bone, there's slight influence on that lower leg from the foot bone. So we need to go into weight paint mode and see what's going on. But first, catch up with me, parenting your mesh to your armature, and have a quick look and test out your rig. Okay, so we need to do a bit of weight painting. If for any reason you've rotated or moved your bones, remember you can select all and press Alt-R to reset their position. So I'll go back into object mode. Let's start with the upper leg, although we know it doesn't need any weight painting, but yours might, depending on the distance you've got here. So I'll select the armature first, then the mesh that I want to weight paint, and go up to the weight paint mode up the top here. Or I can actually press Control-Tab and get the pie menu and choose weight painting that way. So that's Control-Tab. Now at the moment, I can hold down Control and left click to select the bone. And you can see it's all red, so we know that this bone is influencing that mesh 100%. Now we can also go into edit mode. If I go into edit mode here, choose one of the vertices, you can see that there is vertex weights, upper leg, and we've got one there. Let's just try all of these, make sure they've only got one, and they have indeed got one. So all these vertices are fully influenced by the upper leg bone. That's great, we don't need to do any weight painting there. Okay, so let's go back to object mode. So Control-Tab, object mode, choose the armature again, then the next mesh, the lower leg. Control-Tab, weight paint mode, and I've got this bone selected here, and we can see it's got no influence on this mesh because it's blue. I'll press Control left click for the next bone. That's good, but it's got a little bit of discrepancy down the corner here. So that's the bit that's affected by the foot bone. And let's Control click on the foot bone, and again we can see some influence there. And incidentally, you can see the names of the bone here and the names of the mesh. If I Control click on the foot bone, you can see the foot bone there and then the lower leg mesh there, just in case you weren't sure what you're selecting. So I'll select the leg bone again, and I'm going to do some weight painting. So we've got the brush tool up here, and that's the main one that you'll be using. We've got the amount of weight here. So if I paint with this brush in this corner here, we should see it turning red, and that's great. So I'm painting with a weight of 1 down the bottom here. Now I'm going to undo that just to show you the other controls. There's also the strength of the brush. So I'll bring this down to something like 0.1, and if I start painting, it will have a bit of influence, and I need to keep on painting until it goes red. So try not to get the strength of the brush confused with the weight of the brush. The strength is kind of like the flow of ink coming out, and the weight is the ink, which is kind of red in this case, or an influence of 1. So if I turn this back up to 1, all the ink will come out and it will turn it red. And that's great. However, if I Control left click on this bone still has some influence on this mesh, even though I've painted this with red for the other bone. So this bone is fully red here, this one still has some influence. So you can actually go beyond 1 with the influence. I'll just go into edit mode to show you that. So Control-Tab into edit mode, select this one vertex here, and you can see it's got lower leg 0.7 and foot 0.7, which is a bit frustrating really. Now you might say, why don't you just get rid of this one and type in this one at 1? Yes, you can do that, but if you've got lots of vertices, then that can take you a long time. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So for now, we want to learn how to do that with the brush. Well, I'll jump back to weight paint mode. In the options in weight paint mode, so you've got the options here, but you've also got under the tools, so active tools and workspace settings. If I scroll down, you've also got the options here. There's an option called auto normalize. That means when you start painting, it will only give a value of up to 1 and not go over 1 like it is at the moment. So if I select my lower leg bone and start painting, we should see, if I Control left click on this bone now, that it's gotten rid of any weights from the other one because it's auto normalized it and therefore set the weight to 1 for this one. It can't go beyond 1 at that point with auto normalize on. So generally speaking, I think it's a good idea to have this ticked. There's not many instances where you wouldn't. So it looks like we've got this one fully influenced by this bone. Let's click on this bone, rotate it and make sure there's no influence from the foot bone. That's great. Okay, so let's go back to object mode, choose the armature, then the next shape, so that's the active object, Control Tab into weight paint mode. Now this is strange and it's a slight bug. I've got this bone selected, but it looks a little bit more like it's giving me this bone's weights. So if I control click on this bone, that's just to sort of kick it into gear and say, wake up please. So we can see that this bone, most of the influence in this area, but this bone has a very slight bit of influence. You can probably see it's very lighter blue than this dark blue back here. And if I click on this one, that's got some blue as well. So we need to do a little bit of weight painting here. I'll click on this bone, make sure the weight's at 1 and strength to 1, and I'll paint at the back here because we know we want that to be fully influenced by this bone. Let's see if there's any left from this bone, and the auto normalize has done its job. So let's go back to this bone. Now one thing that does help actually, if I scroll down with my tool settings and go to advanced, this option front faces. If I turn that off, it's a little bit easier to paint and you can make sure that you are getting the vertices that you want. It might make more sense to have these vertices as well only affected by this bone, so I'll paint those in, paint them in here, make sure I get everything at the back there as well. And we can of course check by pressing R to rotate, and that's looking good. So pause the video here and catch up with me painting the back of the heel with a weight of 1 for the foot bone. Okay, so we can see this gradual transition from a weight of 1 to a weight of 0 as it comes down this middle part here. And that does make sense. If I control left click on the toes and press R then X, so it rotates around the X axis, you can see it kind of helps it deform slightly. It sort of squishes in a bit there, but that bit of movement on the top of the foot and around the arch helps it to look a little bit more realistic. So I'll cancel that movement. So having a transition like this, a smooth transition, is helpful when you haven't got completely separate objects like we have in the upper leg. So you'll see a lot more of this when you rig a character that's all one object. So it looks as if our weight painting is finished and we've got some good weights on our object. So let's press Control Tab, go to object mode, choose the armature again and just double check by going into pose mode and rotate all the bones around, making sure that we've got a wonderful looking leg. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work ready for next time.